Welcome, everybody. Russ Roberts is joining Josh Savage and myself, Mike Rochansky, for a 30-minute talk on Adam Smith and his two most famous published works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. Dr. Roberts himself is a top economist and research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and host of popular podcast, Econ Talk. Russ, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Russ, let's just dive right into it. First question, how do we handle the Adam Smith problem and the apparently contradicting viewpoints in both works?
So I like to call it the so-called Adam Smith problem. It arose in the 19th century among German scholars that there's some kind of dichotomy, weird dichotomy between Smith's two books. In one, The Wealth of Nations, the most famous one, he sees human beings as very self-interested, whereas The Theory of Moral Sentiments is about benevolence and why we do things that are self-sacrificing. And the correct observation is that there's not a lot in The Wealth of Nations about virtue or self-sacrifice or benevolence. And so how could he write these two books about with these two seemingly very different views of human beings? Now, one argument would be, well, he wrote The Wealth of Nations long after he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Maybe his views changed, he became more cynical, and he focused on the self-interest. The problem is he revised The Theory of Moral Sentiments all through his life, well after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, so that doesn't work. I have a different viewpoint. That's the reason I call it the so-called Adam Smith viewpoint, the so-called Adam Smith problem, which is I really think it's a bit of a straw man. I think in both books he focuses on the very true aspect of our nature, which is that we are self-interested, we are self-centered, we see ourselves as the center of the universe, and that's true no matter how you look at it. What he's interested in the Theory of Moral Sentiments is, how is it that given how self-interested we are, that we can still be somewhat altruistic, somewhat apparently benevolent? But it wasn't because Smith saw us as angels in one book and villains in the other. He refers to what he calls the feeble spark of benevolence. He doesn't rely on our good-heartedness to explain why we do good deeds. And what Smith says in The Theory of Moral Sentiments is the reason we put aside our self-interest in our dealings with people on a one-on-one basis is that if we don't, we're not going to have very many friends, and we're not going to be very successful in life, and we're not going to be respected or honored. So I think there's a very consistent view throughout both books, which is we're very self-interested, we're very self-centered, self-love comes naturally to us, but in our face-to-face dealings with our friends, our family, and our colleagues, there's a tension between our self-interest, our desire to put ourselves first, and our will. The reality is if I'm going to interact with other people, and I always put myself first, I'm not going to interact very successfully. So what Smith's interested in is, how is it that my desire for respect, he calls it our desire to be loved, how is that our desire for respect and honor and reputation, how do I deal with that given that my natural impulse is to always do the self-centered thing? So to me, both books are very consistent. The difference between the two books is that one of them, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is about the interpersonal sphere, how we interact with other people on a face-to-face, very intimate way, whereas The Wealth of Nations is about trade, it's about national interest, it's about all kinds of much larger exchanges that I make across distance and time. And naturally, in those exchanges, self-interest is going to dominate benevolence. I'm not going to make a bad deal for myself in my commercial dealing, say, unless it's with a close friend, in which case the factors in The Theory of Moral Sentiments may very well come into play. But in general, when I'm out exchanging, and a modern idea would be if I'm out on the web trying to find a bargain, or if I'm out at the mall buying something for myself, what's in it for me is going to be at the front of my mind, and that's okay. That's the way we interact with strangers. If I act that way with my friends and family, if I say, what's in it for me all the time with my spouse, with my children, with my colleagues at work, I'm not going to be a very good father, I'm not going to be a very good husband, I'm not going to be a very good colleague. So as Smith understands, I think a very deep insight, my natural impulse is to ask, what's in it for me? But if I act that way in my more personal settings, I'm not going to do very well. And that's what The Theory of Moral Sentiments is about. And so I don't see there being a conflict. And I want to add one other thing, if I could. I think there's an incredibly important thread that runs through both books, which is harmony. What Smith is interested in is, given that we're different, given that we're self-centered, how is it that we can get along with each other? how is it that I can step back from that self-centeredness and have a good conversation? The joke is, well, enough about me. Let's talk about what you think of me. And if you act that way in life, you're not going to have very many friends. And so Smith was interested in how the social norms and rules emerge that restrain that natural impulse to put myself first. And that's what the theory of moral sentiments is about, to a large extent. And then the Wealth of Nations is a different kind of harmony. How is it that all these products that we make that are complicated, that require specialization, how does that work out? And in that book, he's talking about commercial harmony. So one book's about interpersonal harmony, second book's about commercial harmony, and I think in that sense, they're very, very closely related.
Russ, just branching off of what you just talked about, how does ambition, approval, and virtue play into both the theory of moral sentiments and Wealth of Nations?
Well, that's a more complicated story, and I think if there is an Adam Smith problem, you could say that's the real one, which is that in the theory of moral sentiments, he's very dismissive and condemns ambition as a goal. He says we're ambitious. We can't, it's part of our nature. But he basically urges the reader to fight against that ambition, fight against the desire for wealth, fight against the desire for power, fight against the desire for fame. He understands how seductive these are, and he talks at great length about how we naturally are attracted to these things, but he also at the same time says, and don't be. Try to restrain your ambition, restrain your desire for fame and fortune, because they're not going to make you very happy, and you're prone to do some very bad things along the way. At the same time, he understands that we are naturally ambitious and thirsty for fame and thirsty for money. And what I think he does in The Wealth of Nations is spin out the implications of that for our economy. But he's not particularly supportive or kind about those motives. He does not say, oh, those are work out great, because he says they have some good impacts. He talks about in the Theory of Moral Sentiments that a wealthy person's eyes might be bigger than his stomach. He's going to want more stuff. And he says he's wrong. He's not going to be happy when he gets it. But along the way, that'll produce jobs for gardeners and other people in his employ. And he talks about the benefits of that. But it's all along the way. It's not like, go, 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 that's great. He's not a cheerleader for ambition or cheerleader for the acquisition of wealth. And the way I describe it is I think he's very interested in encouraging you to keep it in perspective. Nothing wrong with having money. There's nothing wrong with being ambitious. Nothing wrong with being famous. But if that's your goal, if you set yourself out to achieve those things, you're going to be very disappointed.
What would Smith say are some irrational actions that people do for approval?
For approval, he's very big on condemning people who fawn in hopes of gaining power or the approval of powerful people. He's very, very aware of our natural desire that we want to be loved. We want people to think highly of us. We want people to respect us. And so we're constantly trying to have attention focused on ourselves. And he basically says, that's kind of a fool's game. You're not going to be very happy. It's a little bit interesting. He's one of the most famous people of all time. And he's very successful in his own lifetime. He was not a super wealthy person, but I think he was wealthy by the standards of his day. He was famous, certainly, by the standards of his day. But I think he tried to keep it in perspective. And if you read, for example, what he says about David Hume, his best friend when David Hume passed away, he didn't say, boy, he wrote some fabulous books and he got a lot of money. And what he said was he was a great friend. He kept things in perspective. And that, I think, is if you go and read that letter, you'll see what Smith saw as the true virtues. And I think when he praised Hume, he was praising those virtues.
What is the relationship between material wealth, approval of others, and human happiness in Smith's system?
So Smith says basically that if you want to be happy, the key to being happy is to be loved. And he doesn't mean romantic love, although it's included in it. He means respected, admired, having a good reputation. It's what we might think of as deep satisfaction. He's not talking about going out to a party and being happy afterward or winning some prize and being happy. He's talking about the things that lead to the deep satisfactions of life. And money is not on the list. He's not, in particular, the pursuit of money is not on the list. He thinks that's a very destructive and unhealthy and a bad attribute in terms of achieving happiness. Doesn't think that's how you get there. But he's not a monk. He doesn't suggest you should live, the simplest of lives. But he often, in a couple of places, he says the person who leads a simple life is just as happy as the richest king. And he says the beggar by the side of the road can be as happy as the richest person. So he very much believed that material things were not the source of happiness, were not the source of wealth. And I think that's as true today as it was then. On the other hand, you don't want to be going hungry. You'd want a roof over your head. And I think he was saying that beyond a minimum standard, you're going to be, you can be as happy as anybody with or without money. I think he says, other than being out of debt, having good health, and having a clean conscience, there's really not much else that produces happiness. Now, he never touched an iPhone. So who knows if in today's world he would relate to a modern urge to have gadgets. He was very aware of, even in his time, how much people like gadgets, but they weren't very interesting gadgets. Maybe today's gadgets are a little more defensible as something that people like, but he certainly did not think that material well-being was after a certain minimum, was very important.
Smith believes that prudence, benevolence, and justice, PB&J, all regulated by self-command, gives the best life. Why?
Well, he says, my favorite line in the Theory of Moral Sentiments probably is, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And you start thinking about what that means. And first, loved, he didn't mean romantic love only. He meant respected, honored, admired. And by lovely, he didn't mean attractive. He meant worthy of respect, worthy of admiration, worthy of praise, praiseworthy. So he said that really was what drives us, our desire to be respected and admired by the people around us. And as a result, we were put in actually into a little bit of a dilemma, because the easiest way, Smith says, to be loved is to be rich. The easiest way to be respected and honored and praised is to be famous. And he's very dismissive of celebrity and power and money as the ways to be loved. But it works. We look at our own society, the people, the example I always think of is the Academy Awards. You look at how much adulation and attention the actors and actresses get in that setting, and you see what our culture reveres. And it's very natural. Those people love to be on camera. They love that praise. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them love the attention they get. And we are intrigued and attracted to them because of the amount of attention and respect and admiration that they get. And Smith says that's the wrong way to be loved. The right way to be loved is to be lovely. And by lovely, he meant, again, worthy of honor, praise, respect, but not worthy of it in the sense of earning it through money or fame or power, but earning it through your character. So his guideline is for loveliness is twofold: do the proper thing, be proper, which means conform to the expectations of the people around you, and be virtuous. That's the next level up. And to him, virtue was PB&J, prudence, benevolence, and justice. So if you are prudent, if you take care of yourself, if you are benevolent, that is helpful to others, and if you follow justice, which means not hurting others, then you will be lovely, and you will earn the love and respect and honor of the people around you the right way. And he says very explicitly, he says, the glittering path, the path that attracts us, is the one that's got money, fame, and power, but the quieter path of loveliness is the one he counsels for real happiness and for getting the respect, honor, and admiration of those around us in the right way.
So I guess, how does the motivation of an ambition, that driving desire for wealth and acclaim, that social advancement, maybe through easy means of getting rich and famous, and to be loved, fit in with prudence and fit the different levels?
Well, there's always a tension, Smith says, between this sort of easy way towards being loved, which is money, which is the glittering path, and because that's gold. That's the financial success part, or fame, or power. That's the very natural thing that attracts us. Whereas the better path, Smith suggests, is through virtue, through prudence, benevolence, and justice. Excuse me, it's actually, I've been saying benevolence. I think it's beneficence, actually. I wonder if we should go back and well, whatever. It's actually beneficence, which is good acts. It's good deeds. That's the way Smith encourages us to go, and there's a tension there. Our natural desire is to be attracted to the more glittering path of fame, fortune, and power. And Smith's constantly reminding us, saying, that's a fool's game. It's a fool's game because if once you achieve those things and people pay a lot of attention to you, you're not going to be particularly happy. You like the being loved part, but you're going to know sometimes you're not so lovely. You'll have done things to get to the top. You'll have curried favor with some bad people to get power or fame, and it will tarnish you. And he lived at a time, it's important to point out, he lived at a time when the ways that people got wealth and power and fame were not perhaps as virtuous as they are in our time. In our time, there's still very ugly ways you can become famous and powerful and rich, but there's some pretty nice ways to get rich. One way is to create a fabulous product that improves people's lives, that's used to save their health. It's used, say, in a surgery, a heart surgery. Some incredible things people have done, and they've reaped great financial rewards, but they've done it by making people much better off. Smith lived at a time where it wasn't quite as innovative as our time. And a lot of times I think the way you got wealthy is by currying favor with some member of the nobility who bestowed some monopoly on you. And we still have that. We still have some ugly ways that people use the power of the government to take advantage of other people, but we have lots of other outlets that Smith could only have dreamed of if and may not have.
Russ, Smith seems to describe in Theory of Moral Sentiments a kind of emerging social order through social interaction. Can you offer some insights as to how this order emerges?
Yeah, so Smith has this idea of the impartial spectator. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, a person you imagine watching your actions, and you use that, he argues, you use that mechanism to find out what people like and don't like. So in real life, you go around and you see what you do and how people react to it, and you learn about how people approve or disapprove of your actions, and then you take that data and you sort of create a person who is watching you from the outside, who's impartial, who doesn't have your well-being at stake, isn't on your side, not against you. That person is impartial. So this imaginary person is, for Smith, the source of your conscience and how you decide what to do in certain situations. So there might be a time where by making an immoral decision, you can profit from it. And then ideally, the impartial spectator is sitting there going, oh, that's a bad idea. I wouldn't approve of that. And you realize, oh yeah, when an actual spectator finds out I did this, I'm not going to get their respect. I'm not going to be honored. I'm going to be dishonored. they're going to disapprove of what I did. And so the question then arises, how does that work? How is it that I care about the impartial spectator? And Smith says, or the actual spectators who see what I do, and Smith says we're hardwired. He says the author of nature, in his words, the author of nature meaning God, put into us this desire for approval and a desire to avoid disapproval. So what he's saying is that is our sort of calculus of how we get our pleasure and pain from our social interactions. And because I want to be approved of, I want people to think highly of me, and I know that if I do a bad thing, they're not going to, that helps sustain and create the norms of what's good and bad. Now, Smith's very aware of the fact that we fool ourselves all the time. All right, we can, he says in the heat of the moment, push that impartial spectator aside and don't listen to him. And he says, but later you start thinking about it and you realize, I guess I did the wrong thing there. I probably shouldn't have done that. And we learn. So it's a very imperfect system, the social norms that restrain our self-interest in situations where it's often better to do something for another person. But Smith's interested in that tension between my natural self-centeredness and what another person might say from the outside.
Russ, we have about 5 minutes left for this interview. I'm going to ask you a question that's going to be a main topic in the documentary coming up. What do you think Adam Smith would say about social media in regards to the impartial spectator?
I think there are a couple of places where a Smithian perspective comes into play with respect to social media. One is Smith's very dismissive of what he calls the quackish arts of self-promotion, the embarrassing and goofy ways that people try to get attention for themselves. So if you can imagine that was a problem in 1759, in today's world, what people are willing to do on camera, on YouTube, or on Twitter and Facebook, of course, dwarfs what Smith could have possibly imagined, some of the horrifying things that people do just to go viral. And that's a very human part of us that Smith understood, that we're drawn to the attention that we get from social media, the number of followers we have, how many hits our stuff gets, people are following us on Facebook, and are friending us on Facebook, following us on Twitter. And Smith would not be surprised that we do some pretty bad things or goofy or quackish things to get attention. but I don't think he would say that that was a very good idea. The other part about the social media that I think is that Smith's very relevant for is the way that we approve and disapprove, especially disapprove of people. So, some people have started noticing that somebody makes a joke on Facebook or Twitter, and just an offhand thought they had. They weren't really giving it much thought. Thought it was kind of witty, and so they just kind of typed it in. It's 140 characters. There's a story. This woman typed something in, got on a plane to Africa, and she gets to Africa, and her phone's exploding when she lands because somebody hated what she wrote, thought it was rude or inappropriate or racist. I can't remember what was wrong with it, but somebody thought it was politically incorrect, and thousands of people savaged her online and just humiliated her. And this is a phenomenon in today's world. I don't think it's a big phenomenon, but it affects a lot of people's lives. They say something somewhat innocuous. Maybe it wasn't the most lovely thing to write, but there's not much of a second chance. So I think there's a weird tension in our modern world. We're unbelievably tolerant of people's flaws. We're very unjudgmental. In fact, being judgmental, criticizing someone for something they do is sort of, well, it's not nice, you just live and let live, which is in general, a good thing. But Smith's whole system, to some extent, is driven by disapproval of behavior that's not good. And so our modern world, in many ways, is very tolerant of bad behavior. We're very unjudgmental. But at the same time, social media allows people to be judgmental in an anonymous way. So I think we're very uncomfortable in a face-to-face situation saying, gee, I didn't think what you did was right. That's wrong. But anonymously, it's a lot of fun. So people, I think, are using social media to be very critical of other people, especially when they don't have to bear the costs of a counterpoint. And I think, people who are internet trolls, people who are rude and more than rude, vicious online, are able to do that in the guise of an anonymity and will not do it with their name. They will not do it when their identity is revealed. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how the whole privacy thing plays out over the next few years, because people love, under the cloak of anonymity, being, I think, very, very harsh on other people, face-to-face much less so. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as we go forward.
Russ, last thought before we conclude the interview. In your honest opinion, are Smith's ideas an ideal social order?
Well, I think you have to be careful. I'm a big fan of emergent order that comes from the bottom up and not the top down. And I think human beings are very good at acting collectively without communicating explicitly. So let me explain. So most people think, well, if you got to fix a problem, we have to do it from the top down. We got to get together, either as a group or through the political system or through the state, to solve every problem has got to be solved that way. And Smith, to some extent, is saying, not explicitly all the time, but what he's really saying underneath is, there are a lot of things that solve themselves through our voluntary actions, through these incentives that the impartial spectator and our desire to be loved and lovely can take care of. So that's what emergent order is. I mean, emergent order to some extent in the Smithian world is civility. It's civilization even. It's our ability to interact pleasantly with one another rather than hitting each other over the head with clubs and stealing each other's stuff. So it's really important. Having said that, there are plenty of emergent orders that are not attractive. There's no guarantee that everything that emerges is good. In a racist society, being a racist is lovely, and not being a racist is not lovely. So I think you have to be careful about overselling the virtues of an emergent order. But I think in general, we're lucky in the United States, at least, to live in a place where, at least till now, many, many of the emergent norms and values are positive and encourage people to do good things. And I want a world where there's more room for that, and the government doesn't squeeze or push down the opportunity for us to work voluntarily, cooperatively, in these emergent bottom-up ways to solve all kinds of problems.
Russ, you just mentioned the United States. Which country fits best with the ideals of Adam Smith?
That's a hard question to answer. Over the last 100 years, maybe, certainly the last 50 years, has been a steady growth in the size of government. And that's left less room for what sometimes is called civil society, the ability of individuals to work collectively in a voluntary way rather than coercively through the power of the state. And so when I look at that, I get sort of worried about the future of the United States, and I get a little bit depressed that the glass is maybe half empty rather than half full. Having said that, there's still an enormous amount of freedom in the United States for entrepreneurs and innovation. And I still think we have an incredibly free society, certainly relative to history before the American Revolution. If we take the long picture, we go back a few thousand years, the United States remains something of a grand experiment. And I can only hope that we can continue to restrain some of the worst of government intervention and let some things flourish from the bottom up.
Russ Roberts, research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and host of popular talk show Econ Talk. Russ, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.